Hey there, and welcome to week 2 in Red Dirt Spirit's series on the letter to the Ephesians. Do you ever get the feeling that we as humanity are disconnected from the best version of ourselves? As if there's a state of being at peace with each other and the earth that feels possible, but is just out of reach? We're divided as a people. We seem to keep finding more and more ways to split and divide ourselves as different and against those people over there, whether the untold amounts of war or political points of view, religious differences, family rifts and division, some lasting for years simply because of misunderstandings or injustices and hurts. This sense of disconnection is clearly more than just a feeling. It's a misshapen reality in comparison to what we were created for. Paul opens his letter to the Ephesians with a greeting and then launches into an extraordinarily long and complex 257-word sentence in Ephesians 1:3 through 14. If you're new to the Bible, this particular letter is towards the back and is the 10th segment or book of the New Testament. Paul uses this epic opener to remind the churches to whom he's writing of their truest identity and the story that they are now a part of because of the faithfulness of Jesus, the Messiah. In chapter 1, Paul uses very specific language of us and you. Well, actually, he doesn't say you because in Greek as well as in Hebrew, there's a specific second person plural. So instead of saying you, he says you all. And because of my southern roots from the States, I'm going to shorten it to y'all, which is perfectly accurate and perfectly true. So Paul uses a lot of us and y'all language, and he does so intentionally. When Paul says us or we here, he's talking about the Jews, members of God's covenant family. And then when we read him saying you, or you could just insert y'all in there, he's addressing the non-Jewish Gentile audience. Knowing this is really helpful and even points us to what's happening here in this part of the letter. Paul says that God predestined Israel, the Jewish people, to represent his life and goodness to the world for the purpose of reuniting heaven and earth, and a major part of that unifying work is bringing in the non-Jews to be a part of this sacred and chosen family. This is a major theme throughout the letter, so let's unpack some of where these ideas come from today. The earliest stories in the Bible lay the groundwork for understanding what the rest of the Bible is all about. The first few stories in the Hebrew Scriptures, or what some people call the Old Testament, are about a spiritual being that's so powerful the earth and skies were formed through his expressions of love and beauty, goodness and structure and design, seasons of work and seasons of rest. And while this spiritual being is powerful enough to generate a universe, he's also loving and serving and building a world not just for his sake, but for the benefit of others. This loving and creative being desired to share this creative and servant-hearted power and chose to gift the role of co-ruling the cosmos with spiritual beings, which the creation story says are represented by stars and celestial or heavenly bodies. In Hebrew, the word translated for heavens simply means skies. We'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 2. But he also chose to share this co-rule with terrestrial or earthly beings. And that's us, by the way. That's our job. Did you know that? According to the biblical story, our truest purpose is to be co-rulers with God, reflecting his overflowing light and love and goodness and creativity throughout the world by the way we live our lives, individually, but also communally. Now, I know this terminology of ruling the cosmos might sound a bit odd to us today or even presumptuous to us, and it might be more helpful today to think about this role as custodians and cultivators of creation. But this language of ruling would have connected deeply with its original audience. In fact, the entire creation story is a poetic narrative that, in an ancient way of seeing the world, shows God, this divine being, as a cosmic king constructing the earth and the skies as his sacred temple, where heaven and earth operate as a unified reality, fluid but distinct. God, in his image, creates and blesses humanity, telling them to make more of themselves and fill the earth. This imaging of God is language associated with the temple and spoke of humans' special task to live in the world as representatives of their Creator. And part of that task and blessing is that they would continue to expand and fill the earth with color and languages and cultures, and that their unity and diversity would be a mirror to God's unity and diversity. So, what's happening here? In this story, at the beginning of the Hebrew Scriptures, God is growing a family inside of His creation. But through an impressive pileup of bad decisions, the co-rulers, both celestial and terrestrial, rebel against God, causing a split, a division between God's realm and human's realm. And instead of blessing and expanding beauty and goodness, instead they fill the earth with injustice and violence. At the climax of this rebellion, which you can read about in Genesis 11, is the famous Tower of Babel incident, where the humans decide that instead of filling the earth, the writer of Genesis says they all spoke one language, and wanting to centralize their power and population, they built this epic temple and tower specifically to keep from becoming scattered throughout the earth. This act was an autonomous grab for power apart from their connection with their Creator. So God confuses their language and scatters them across the world. This wasn't only an act of judgment from God, it was also an act of mercy. Remember, God's blessing and purpose was for all of humanity to grow and expand into multiple languages and cultures, and this gift was now to keep them from forming a single, homogeneous, monocultured group. The next section of Genesis tells the story of how, with humanity in constant rebellion, divided against God and violent against each other, God chooses a single man, Abraham, and his family, the Israelites, to be the primary vehicle through which he will bring blessing back to all of humanity. Unfortunately, Israel fails miserably at this task and are no better at representing the Creator than the rest of the nations. So over time, Israel's prophets, poets, and wise sages see a bit of a conundrum. One, God has chosen to marry himself to humanity for humans to accomplish their task of ruling the earth on God's behalf. And two, humans seem to be proving that they are incapable of fulfilling this task. They begin dreaming and writing about a true king, one who will not only know the wisdom and teachings of God, but who also will be able to fully live them out. They call this king their Mashiach, which simply means anointed or chosen one. This anointing referred to a ritual that would usually look like pouring oil or smearing oil over someone's head, symbolizing the appointing of a new king or someone who is specifically chosen by God for a specific task. King David was a key figure in Israel's story as God's anointed king, but he also was far from perfect, and after his death, his kingly line pretty well ran Israel right off the rails and continued the cycle of rebellion against their Creator. So again, the prophets and poets of Israel, those who remained loyal to God, began hoping for a new David, one from his kingly line who would actually be able to be faithful to their covenant with God, leading Israel back into her chosen, and there's that word chosen again, her chosen task of being a blessing to all of the nations. Now, all of that, is the story Paul has been immersed in, not just for his life, but for centuries of Jewish people before him. And this is what Paul means when he uses words like chosen, predestined, or election. That Yahweh, the God of Israel and God of all creation, specifically chose Israel to be his vehicle of blessing, and that this ultimately would take place under the reign and rule of a new king, God's anointed one, the Hebrew Mashiach, or in English, the Messiah. And this word gets translated in Greek, which is the language that Paul's writing in, as Christos, or as we say in English, Christ. Christ literally means the anointed one, the one chosen to get Israel's story and calling back on track. If you remember from Acts 9, Paul has a radical and transformative encounter with the risen Jesus, and he and many of Jesus' other followers were convinced that Jesus was this Messiah, and that through his life, death, and resurrection from death, God had placed all of heaven and earth under his rule as the one true king of the cosmos. In verse 10 of Ephesians 1, right in the middle of this long sentence, Paul drives home his message. In the midst of all the brokenness and division that's visible throughout the world and throughout their lives, through Jesus the Messiah, God has begun the process of drawing up together and unifying all things in heaven and on earth. And in verse 13, Paul shifts from this us and we language and then begins to address the non-Jews by using the y'all. He says that this act of God can be seen in the adoption of these Gentiles who were not descendants of Abraham. They were not a part of God's chosen family from way back when, but they are now being invited into this story of God's people and this sacred task of revealing his character and love to the rest of the world and to this ancient, socially, culturally, and ethnically divided group of people. This was great and joyful news that God, the creator of the universe, was available and wanted to draw near to them. And we, still today, anyone, Jewish or not, are also a part of this unifying work of a good and beautiful creator. Well, that's it for this week. Please join us next week as we explore the second half of this chapter where Paul shifts into more y'all language and praise for an apocalypse.